Picture a rural village. You have a woman there, and she is trading global currency on her smartphone.
Right, just instantly receiving a digital remittance from someone halfway across the world.
Exactly. The transaction takes, what, maybe 3 seconds? But then she puts the phone down,
Yeah.
she turns around, and she spends the next 4 hours sitting in this incredibly smoke-filled room. And she's cooking her family's dinner by burning dried animal dung and wood.
It is just such a jarring image. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way.
Yes, welcome. Today, we are bringing you a custom-tailored deep dive into a society that is moving at two completely different velocities.
Right, like occupying two entirely different centuries, but on the exact same plot of land.
It really is the ultimate paradox of modern development, and we are unpacking this today through a highly specialized, intensely data-driven presentation outline.
Yeah, and this outline was actually designed specifically for expert data visualizers. It's fascinating.
The overarching topic of this source material is called Senegal's growth paradox: digital boom versus structural rupture from 1960 to 2024.
It's a huge timeline.
Hmm.
And our mission today is really to figure out why this is happening.
Right. Why, in an era where a single smartphone connects you instantly to the global financial network, does the most basic, fundamental survival infrastructure just completely stall out?
Like having clean air to breathe while you cook.
Exactly. And maybe more importantly, who is actually paying the hidden costs of this so-called digital prosperity?
That is the million-dollar question. And, the source material we're working from today is super interesting because of its strict design constraints.
Oh yeah, the aesthetic guidelines are so specific.
They really are. It relies entirely on World Bank macroeconomic databases. But it instructs the designers to just strip away all the usual corporate gloss.
No fancy graphics.
None. The requested visual aesthetic is strictly minimalist. Stark white backgrounds, low saturation academic colors.
And absolutely no 3D element.
Right. No 3D, no distracting graphics at all. It basically forces you to confront the raw data head on.
And the opening visual that they request for slide 1 is honestly just devastating.
It really sets the tone.
It does. So picture a clean white slide. On the left side, you have this towering dark blue bar graph.
Which represents financial inclusion.
Yeah. It shows that over just a 10-year span, financial account ownership in Senegal exploded. It went from under 6% of the population to over 76%.
Which is a massive leap. It's what they call a typical African digital miracle.
But then you look at the right side of the slide, and there is this tiny dark red bar that is barely lifting off the axis.
And that one represents the rural clean energy access rate.
Exactly, sitting at a catastrophic 8.8%.
Wow.
And the slide just has a simple black arrow connecting the soaring blue bar to the flat red bar, with the caption, "Two eras on the same land."
That is powerful. Because when you put those two metrics side by side like that, it just completely shatters the traditional narrative of how a country develops.
Right, because historically, we assume modernization happens in a specific sequence.
Yeah, you build roads, you lay water pipes, you electrify the entire grid, and then only upon that physical foundation you build an advanced financial and communications network.
But Senegal, like a lot of emerging markets, honestly, has completely inverted that sequence.
They flipped it upside down.
Yeah.
And the executive summary on slide 2 really lays this out using these 3 clean little spark line graphs.
Okay, let's unpack that. What do the spark lines show?
So the first one shows steady, flat GDP growth climbing up. The second shows the digital and financial inclusion just vertically soaring.
And the third?
The third is the hidden cost. It shows external debt and carbon emissions growing exponentially.
Okay, so to understand how they arrived at this inversion, we really need to wind the clock back. Let's look at the macroeconomic baseline.
Yeah, slide 3 traces the trajectory starting all the way back from 1960.
Right around the era of independence.
Exactly. And if you look at the GDP per capita, and this is measured in constant 2015 US dollars, just to strip out the noise of inflation, the line from 1960 to the year 2000 is basically a flat line.
4 decades of almost total economic stagnation.
It's a generational trauma, honestly, and it's very common in post-colonial economies across sub-Saharan Africa.
Because you have a newly independent state trying to build institutional capacity completely from scratch.
Right, and they are entirely reliant on exporting raw commodities. In Senegal's case, that was primarily peanuts and phosphates.
Which means their entire national budget is at the mercy of completely volatile global commodity prices.
Yeah. And then you layer on the global oil shocks of the 1970s, plus the crushing debt crises of the 1980s.
And the structural adjustment program.
Oh, absolutely. The structural adjustment programs mandated by international lenders, which often forced them to make deep cuts to public spending.
So for 40 years, the average citizen sees absolutely no meaningful improvement in their standard of living. The national wealth is just kind of treading water.
But then something shifts. Right around the year 2000, the presentation shows this deep gray trend line suddenly hiking upward.
It's a steep, sustained climb, right?
Yeah, a very clear acceleration phase.
Hmm.
By 2022, the GDP per capita reaches roughly $1,511.
Which officially places them in the category of a lower middle income country.
Exactly. It is a genuine, undeniable acceleration in wealth generation compared to the previous 40 years.
But the source material asks us to look mechanically at what is actually driving that upward climb. And this is where we encounter the phenomenon of the telecommunications leapfrog.
This is slide 4, right? The digital jump.
Yes. The data shows that Senegal entirely bypassed the traditional landline phase.
They just skipped it completely.
Yeah. Throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, fixed telephone subscriptions per 100 people sat at a fraction of 1%.
The government simply could not lay the copper wire.
Why is that so difficult? I mean, Western countries did it a century ago.
Well, laying a national landline network is an incredibly heavy lift for a developing state. It requires massive upfront capital expenditure.
Like buying the actual materials?
Yeah, and you have to secure land rights, dig thousands of miles of trenches, lay these heavy copper cables, and then crucially, you have to protect those cables from weather, erosion, and theft.
Oh, right. Copper is highly valuable.
Super valuable. In areas with extreme poverty, unguarded public utility lines often just get dug up and sold for scrap. The state simply lacked the institutional capacity and the capital to enforce a physical grid across that kind of vast terrain.
But then mobile cellular technology arrives in the late 90s.
And the subscription rate just absolutely skyrockets.
It goes from absolute zero to 123.9 mobile phones for every 100 people by 2021.
Over 123% penetration. It's wild. And at the same time, internet penetration jumps to cover over 60% of the total population.
I mean, it's like skipping the invention of the automobile and going straight from riding horses to flying jets.
That is a great analogy, because the mechanics of building a mobile network are just fundamentally different from laying copper wire.
Because it's decentralized.
Exactly. It's decentralized, and it transmits through the air. You do not need a continuous physical trench connecting the capital city to a remote village.
You just need a tower.
Right. You secure a single small footprint of land, erect a steel tower, attach a transmission dish, and power it. Often with its own dedicated diesel generator or solar panel if the local grid is bad.
And crucially, the state doesn't have to build it.
Nope. Private, multinational telecommunications companies come in. They look at this massive untapped market and they deploy their own capital because the return on investment is incredibly fast.
Because they sell prepaid SIM cards.
Yes.
Okay.
Which completely eliminates the need for credit checks or mailing out monthly bills. They are literally monetizing the airwaves.
So that's the core mechanism of the leapfrog. It shifts the burden of infrastructure development from a capital-starved public sector dealing in physical dirt.
To a highly capitalized private sector dealing in invisible radio frequencies.
It makes perfect sense. And the presentation specifically highlights that crossing the 100% threshold marks a shift into a multi-device era.
Right, because people hold dual SIM cards to navigate between different network coverage zones, or they have a separate phone for business and personal use.
So the government couldn't build roads fast enough, but the private sector built an information superhighway that requires zero asphalt.
Exactly. And the direct descendant of that telecommunications leapfrog is the mobile money revolution.
Which is detailed on slide 5, and the outline designs this as a scatter and step chart.
To show the explosion of financial inclusion.
Yeah. In 2011, a mere 5.8% of the population aged 15 and older had an account at a financial institution or a mobile money provider.
Less than 6 out of 100 people.
Basically nobody.
The entire economy was functioning on physical cash,
Okay.
which is slow, it's dangerous to transport, and it is incredibly difficult to save securely.
If you wanted to send money from the capital back to your family in a rural village, you literally had to hand physical banknotes to a bus driver.
And just pray he actually delivered it.
But over the next 10 years, that financial inclusion metric doesn't just double. It rockets to 76.4% by 2021.
The design notes for this slide call for a massive, bolded upward arrow with the text 13x growth.
13 times. And the data points out that this wasn't just wealthy urbanites. Even among the poorest 40% of the population, account ownership reached nearly 69%.
Which is just phenomenal.
Right.
But to understand how a developing nation banks millions of rural citizens in a single decade, we have to look at the underlying technology.
Because it's not smartphones, right?
No, it does not rely on smartphones. And it does not rely on a 4G internet connection either.
So how does it work?
It utilizes a protocol called USSD, Unstructured Supplementary Service Data.
Okay, what is that?
It's the exact same technology you use when you type a short code with an asterisk and a hash symbol to check your prepaid minutes.
Oh, wow. So a farmer with a 10-year-old basic brick phone standing in a field with barely 1 bar of 2G signal can use this.
Yes, they can interact directly with the telecom servers. The telecom company basically acts as the centralized ledger.
That is incredibly efficient.
It is. But the true genius of mobile money is how it solves the last-mile physical cash problem.
Right, because you eventually need physical money to buy food.
Exactly. And instead of building expensive marble bank branches with heavy vaults and armed guards, the telecom companies just deputize the existing informal economy.
How so?
The local shopkeeper who sells soap and rice in the village becomes an authorized mobile money agent. They leverage the shopkeeper's physical presence and their personal supply of cash.
Ah, so if you receive a digital remittance on your phone, you just walk to the local kiosk.
Right. You transfer the digital float to the shopkeeper's account via a quick text code, and the shopkeeper hands you physical cash from their till.
And the shopkeeper earns a micro commission on the transaction.
Yep. It is an incredibly resilient, decentralized financial network. It scales organically because it incentivizes the local actors.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting, though. We celebrate a 123% mobile adoption rate. The macroeconomic charts look fantastic.
On paper, yes.
But cell phones need to be charged. Cell towers need electricity. A digital bank account is entirely useless if the physical world around you hasn't changed.
And that is the exact pivot the presentation makes on slide 6. This is the structural rupture.
Yeah, the illusion shatters. The presentation shifts focus from the invisible airwaves down to the physical ground.
Let's look at the national electricity access rate. By 2022, it reached 74.2%.
Which on paper sounds like steady progress.
It does. But the source material immediately dissects that average to reveal this extreme, deeply concerning inequality.
They use a visual called a trellis chart to break down the urban-rural divide, and the gap is staggering.
In urban centers, electricity access is at 96.1%. It's nearly universal.
Streetlights, air conditioning.
Yeah. But out in the rural areas, the access rate drops to 56.5%.
So nearly half of the rural population lives entirely off the grid.
Right. And we have to think mechanically about what that means for a population that supposedly has a 123% mobile phone penetration rate.
How do you even participate in a digital economy when you don't have a wall outlet?
You rely on makeshift, high-friction workarounds.
Like what?
Well, if you don't have grid power, you take your phone to a local kiosk operator who owns a diesel generator, or maybe a large car battery hooked up to a small solar panel.
And you pay them just to charge your battery.
Exactly. You pay a premium. You are paying vastly more per kilowatt hour than an urban resident on the municipal grid.
Wow. So the infrastructure literally forces a poverty penalty on the rural user.
It absolutely does. But electricity is really only the first layer of this physical infrastructure failure.
Right, because slide 7 zeroes in on an even more visceral metric for basic human well-being, cooking fuel.
Yes. This is what the researchers explicitly label as the ultimate indicator of hidden poverty.
And the source material visualizes this in a way that is just visually devastating. They use a waffle chart.
A 10 by 10 grid.
Imagine this grid of 100 identical squares representing 100 rural citizens. The designers are instructed to fill just 9 of those squares in a bright, clean blue.
Representing the 8.8% of rural residents who have access to clean cooking fuels, like liquid petroleum gas or electricity.
And the other 91 squares are colored in a suffocating toxic gray.
It is a stark visual. Nationwide, only about 34% of the total population uses clean fuel.
In cities, it's roughly 61%.
But in the rural areas, 91% of the population is relying on what is known as solid biomass.
Which means gathering wild firewood, producing charcoal, or drying animal dung, and burning it inside their homes to cook their daily meals. So if 9 out of 10 rural citizens are inhaling highly toxic smoke inside their homes every single day, is it really fair to call this a modernized economy?
Not at all. Think about the physical reality of that.
Yeah.
We celebrate a mobile money transaction that takes 3 seconds. But to cook a pot of rice, a family has to burn dung inside a poorly ventilated structure.
The juxtaposition is horrifying.
It is. And the human cost of this isn't just an inconvenience, it is a systemic, daily health catastrophe.
Can you break down the mechanics of indoor air pollution? Because I don't think people realize how bad it is.
Yeah, absolutely. When you burn solid biomass in an open fire or an inefficient traditional stove, it doesn't undergo complete combustion.
Meaning it creates a lot of smoke.
More than just smoke. It releases a massive amount of particulate matter, specifically PM2.5, alongside carbon monoxide and volatile organic compounds.
And PM 2.5 is the really dangerous stuff, right?
It is. These are microscopic particles. When inhaled daily in an enclosed space, they penetrate deep into the lung tissue and enter the bloodstream.
And who is bearing the brunt of this? It's not the men out working in the fields or the urban centers.
No, it is almost exclusively women and young children who spend the most time indoors near the hearth.
The World Health Organization tracks mortality rates attributed to household air pollution, and the numbers are staggering.
They are. These women and children are developing chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, acute respiratory infections, pneumonia, and lung cancer,
All from cooking dinner.
and entirely within their own kitchens. The rates rival the most heavily polluted industrial zones on Earth.
And beyond the direct health crisis, there is an immense economic mechanism at play here, too. Time poverty.
Yes, time poverty is a massive factor.
If a woman in a rural village has to spend 3 or 4 hours every single day walking miles to forage for firewood, chopping it, carrying it back,
And then spending another 2 hours tending a low-efficiency fire.
she has absolutely no time to participate in that vaunted digital economy.
Time poverty completely chokes off economic mobility. A smartphone cannot generate wealth if the user's entire day is consumed by the basic thermodynamic struggle of boiling water.
This is why the concept of hidden poverty is so critical to this deep dive.
Exactly. Traditional development economics loves to track GDP per capita and internet connectivity because those lines are moving up and they're easy to measure.
But those macro indicators can completely mask the fatal everyday realities of lacking physical infrastructure.
You could be a statistical success story in a World Bank database, holding a digital wallet with a positive balance, while simultaneously dying of respiratory failure from indoor air pollution.
It's a brutal indictment of how we define a modern economy. The government essentially allowed foreign telecom capital to blanket the country in profitable digital signals.
They completely abdicated the grueling, unprofitable work of preventing their citizens from inhaling toxic smoke.
They subsidized the illusion of modernity.
That's a great way to put it. And this structural rupture isn't limited to energy either. The presentation moves deeper into the fundamental soil of the economy on slide 8.
Examining what happens when human capital is neglected in favor of digital superstructure.
Let's look at education. The source material instructs the designers to build a funnel chart here.
Ha! Right! To visualize the education system.
Hmm.
The wide opening at the top represents primary school enrollment.
Which has climbed to roughly 76%. Getting kids in the door at an early age has seen moderate success.
But as you move down the funnel towards secondary education, it narrows aggressively. The system is just hemorrhaging students.
The critical data point they zero in on focuses on junior high-aged males.
The out-of-school rate for this demographic hovers relentlessly around 68%.
Nearly 7 out of 10 boys are dropping out before they even finish junior high.
Which is insane. You can't code the next great mobile money app or engineer a modern power grid if you're dropping out of school in the 6th grade.
Exactly. It's like trying to run a massive high-end server farm on EVA batteries.
It just won't work.
You can build all the mobile money apps and digital banking superstructures you want, but the human capital simply lacks the sustained voltage required to power a 21st century digital economy.
How does a country expect to turn a population boom into a digital dividend with this kind of talent leak?
They can't. You cannot manage complex international supply chains or engineer networks if the vast majority of your workforce lacks basic secondary education.
And we have to ask mechanically, where do those 68% of boys actually go when they fall out of the funnel?
They don't just vanish. They fall directly into the informal economy.
They become street vendors in Dakar.
Or they take up low-skilled manual labor. But most commonly, they return to the rural villages to engage in subsistence agriculture.
Which perfectly transitions into the next structural fragility identified on slide 9, the agricultural sector.
Yes, agriculture is Senegal's traditional economic pillar, employing a massive portion of the population, yet it is wildly inefficient.
The visual required for this section is a minimalist donut chart. The instructions ask for 91% of the ring to be filled in a dark, stark teal color.
Leaving only a tiny 9% sliver in gray.
And that 91% represents the agricultural sector's share of the nation's total freshwater withdrawals.
It's massive. Farming is essentially running a monopoly on the country's water supply.
And the mechanism behind that massive water consumption is a severe lack of modern infrastructure, right?
Precisely. Senegalese agriculture, particularly in the traditional Pina Basin, is heavily reliant on rain-fed practices and highly inefficient flood irrigation.
They aren't using localized, computer-controlled drip irrigation networks that deliver precise amounts of water directly to the roots.
No, they are largely pumping groundwater or diverting surface water and just letting it flood the fields, which leads to massive evaporation and runoff.
And when we overlay this inefficient water usage with the reality of climate change, the fragility of the entire national economy becomes absolutely terrifying.
Because Senegal is located in the Sahel region, an area incredibly vulnerable to escalating climate volatility.
We're talking about erratic rainfall patterns, prolonged multi-year droughts.
And creeping desertification from the Sahara.
When your primary employer and traditional economic pillar requires 91% of your fresh water just to maintain baseline low-yield production, you have absolutely zero buffer.
If a severe drought hits, the agricultural sector doesn't just lose money, it threatens the national food supply.
And it risks completely depleting the aquifers that the urban centers rely on for drinking water.
The presentation uses a really strong architectural metaphor here. You cannot support a massive, heavy 21st century digital canopy if the soil beneath the roots is eroding.
The rural boys dropping out of junior high are returning to work on farms that are literally draining the country dry,
while producing a fraction of the economic value that modern high-tech agriculture could achieve.
So we arrive at this profound contradiction. The GDP has been climbing since the year 2000. Mobile phones are ubiquitous.
But the people are cooking with animal dung, dropping out of junior high at a rate of 68%, and exhausting the national water supply on low-yield farming.
This immediately begs the question, if the internal economy is this broken, how is the state actually paying for the GDP growth and the infrastructure that does exist?
Who's financing the illusion, right?
Exactly. And to answer that, the source material forces us to look at the macroeconomic ledger on slides 10, 11, and 12.
It outlines three massive, hidden price tags attached to the post-2000 growth: carbon, debt, and aid dependency.
Okay, let's examine the carbon explosion first on slide 10. The data indicates that carbon dioxide emissions have skyrocketed.
And this specifically excludes land use changes, so we are talking purely about industrial and energy-related emissions.
The slide visualizes this with an area chart shooting up exponentially from a 1990 baseline, ending with a stark red circle at the top, highlighting a staggering 500% increase.
500%. Many development economists champion the idea of decoupling.
Right. This is the hope that emerging nations can utilize advanced digital efficiencies and leapfrog directly into renewable energy,
allowing their GDP to grow without a corresponding spike in carbon emissions.
But the data here brutally dispels that hope for Senegal. Their growth has decidedly not decoupled from environmental degradation.
No, it hasn't.
But what exactly is burning to cause a 500% spike in emissions if the rural population isn't even on the grid?
It's the mechanics of a fragmented, informal modernization. Remember how we discussed charging mobile phones off the grid?
Oh, the diesel generators?
Exactly. That requires tens of thousands of decentralized, highly inefficient two-stroke diesel generators running in villages across the country.
And in the urban centers.
Rapid population growth leads to massive traffic congestion, primarily utilizing imported, older model combustion engine vehicles that lack modern emissions controls.
And the national grid itself.
While expanding, it still relies heavily on imported heavy fuel oil and coal to meet the surging baseline demand of the newly electrified urban centers.
So the digital economy runs on servers and cell towers, and those towers are ultimately powered by burning fossil fuels.
It sounds like this entire economic climb was put on a high-interest credit card, and the environment is footing the bill.
Which brings us to the actual financial debt on slide 11. The presentation shows that long-term external debt, the debt owed to foreign creditors, has grown non-linearly.
It has broken past the tens of billions of dollars mark. And the visual literally highlights a debt acceleration zone in recent years.
This requires a deep dive into the mechanics of sovereign debt. How does this work?
When a country like Senegal wants to build a new toll road or a new power plant, and they cannot generate enough tax revenue internally because so much of their economy is informal, they have to borrow capital from the outside,
They issue sovereign bonds on the international market?
often denominated in US dollars or euros.
Mhm.
Or they take multilateral loans from institutions like the World Bank, or bilateral loans from foreign governments.
And the critical danger here is that they are borrowing in foreign currency.
Precisely. If the local currency devalues, or if global interest rates rise, the cost of servicing that debt absolutely balloons, regardless of what is happening in the domestic economy.
A massive, growing percentage of their gross national income is being mortgaged just to service historical debt.
And even with all this borrowing, the data reveals a third hidden cost on slide 12: chronic dependency on foreign aid.
The slides track Net Official Development Assistance, or ODA. This is the foreign aid flowing in from the UN, global health funds, and international development agencies.
The chart shows two parallel dashed lines, creating a channel between 6% and 10%.
For decades, foreign aid has consistently accounted for 6 to 10% of Senegal's entire gross national income.
We have to pause and process what that means mechanically for a sovereign state.
If nearly 10% of your national income is generated by foreign aid, year after year.
It means your domestic economy is structurally incapable of keeping itself alive.
To make sense of this, we need to introduce two crucial economic concepts: extensive growth versus endogenous growth.
Yes, this is a vital distinction. Extensive growth is economic expansion achieved simply by shoveling more inputs into the furnace.
So you borrow $1 billion from foreign bondholders.
You receive $500 million in foreign aid, you burn massive amounts of imported diesel fuel, and your GDP number goes up.
You build some shiny new infrastructure in the capital, but the growth is entirely dependent on external infusions of capital and resources.
If the foreign lenders close the spigot, the growth instantly collapses.
It's the economic equivalent of a sugar rush.
Exactly. Endogenous growth, on the other hand, is self-sustaining internal wealth generation. It happens organically from within.
Like when your education system retains that 68% of junior high boys.
Yes, turning them into skilled technicians who innovate new local industries. It occurs when you implement drip irrigation, allowing farmers to grow high-value export crops using a fraction of the water.
Endogenous growth is driven by efficiency, human capital, and internal technological advancement.
And the fact that Senegal is still leaning on foreign aid for up to 10% of its GNI, while its external debt skyrockets, objectively proves that their post-2000 boom is almost entirely extensive growth.
They are not generating enough internal wealth to lay their own water pipes or string their own rural power lines.
And we must be absolutely clear here. The data in this presentation is strictly analytical. We are not making a political judgment on the fairness of global financial systems or the historical origins of international debt.
Right. The mathematical reality presented by the World Bank data is simply that this economic model creates an existential vulnerability.
A sovereign nation cannot dictate its own future if the basic survival of its rural population depends on the generosity of foreign aid budgets and the risk appetite of international bond markets.
Which brings us to the grand synthesis of the presentation on slide 13, the diagnosis matrix.
This is a four-quadrant chart mapping out this massive structural contradiction.
On the x-axis, you have the speed of adoption or development. On the y-axis, you have the quality of the structural foundation.
This matrix perfectly visualizes the trap the country is in.
In the bottom right quadrant, high speed but low foundation, you place mobile communications and digital finance.
Because these technologies moved at lightning speed, reaching 123% and 76% penetration.
But they do not fundamentally support the physical survival of the human being using them.
And then, in the bottom left quadrant, low speed and low foundation, you place the true physical baseline.
Rural power, clean cooking fuel, and junior high education. The metrics sitting in the single digits or suffering massive failure rates.
The overarching diagnosis of this matrix is that Senegal is at severe risk of falling into a lower middle income trap.
How does that trap work mechanically?
Well, a country enters the lower middle income tier by doing exactly what Senegal did: urbanizing, taking on debt to build initial infrastructure, and adopting easily imported foreign technology like mobile networks.
This creates a quick burst of extensive GDP growth.
But to break through to the next level, to become a high-income, truly modernized economy, You cannot rely on imported tech and raw labor. You must transition to endogenous growth.
You need a highly educated workforce capable of complex manufacturing and high-level services.
But if 91% of your rural population is trapped in the time poverty of gathering firewood, and 68% of your youth are dropping out of school to work in inefficient farming,
You hit a glass ceiling.
you hit a rigid, unbreakable ceiling. You can only sell so many mobile data plans to a population that hasn't graduated junior high.
The digital superstructure eventually suffocates because the physical roots are rotting.
So how do they fix the roots?
The presentation doesn't just diagnose the illness, it outlines 3 specific strategic recommendations for policymakers on slide 15.
First, energy equity. The directive here is clear. The government must prioritize rural microgrids and clean stove subsidies with the exact same level of national urgency and capital investment as they did with digital infrastructure.
They have to stop treating clean cooking as a niche, feel-good project for international NGOs and start treating it as a matter of supreme national security.
Because health security translates directly to economic security.
If you eliminate indoor air pollution, you drastically reduce the burden on the public health system.
And you instantly return millions of hours of lost labor to the women of the country, allowing them to actually utilize those digital financial tools to build wealth.
The second recommendation addresses the massive external vulnerabilities: debt management and green transition.
The slide suggests utilizing complex climate finance tools, specifically mentioning debt for nature swaps.
To simultaneously ease the external debt burden and cap the 500% carbon explosion, how does a developing nation actually execute a high-level climate finance maneuver like that?
It's a fascinating mechanism that bridges global finance with local ecology. Let's walk through exactly how a debt for nature swap operates.
Okay, lay it out for me.
Imagine the Senegalese government owes $1 billion to a syndicate of foreign bondholders or a bilateral creditor.
Right.
A major international environmental organization or a coalition of wealthy donor nations steps in. They offer to buy that debt off the creditors at a discount, or they guarantee the restructuring of the debt at a much lower interest rate.
Why would the creditors agree to a discount?
Because emerging market debt carries a risk of default. The creditors would rather take a guaranteed, slightly reduced payout backed by a massive international organization than risk the country defaulting entirely and getting nothing.
Okay, so the debt is restructured. How does that help the environment?
The catch is the conditions placed on the sovereign nation. In exchange for having their external debt reduced by, say, $200 million, the Senegalese government legally commits to taking the money they would have spent paying back the foreign banks,
And doing what with it?
routing it into a legally binding, independently audited domestic trust fund. That fund can only be used for verified green initiatives.
Like protecting coastal mangrove forests.
Or, crucially for our discussion, subsidizing the rollout of rural solar microgrids and clean cooking infrastructure.
It's a brilliant redirection of capital. Instead of leading their national wealth to service interest payments in Paris or New York, they're legally mandated to invest that exact same capital into the physical survival infrastructure of their own rural citizens.
It is brilliant in theory. But the mechanics of execution highlight the ultimate tragedy of the education funnel.
Because you need smart people to manage it.
Exactly. To successfully negotiate and execute a multi-hundred-million-dollar debt for nature swap requires immense institutional capacity.
The state needs legions of highly trained financial analysts, environmental scientists to establish the baselines.
And legal auditors to prove to the international community that the funds are not being lost to corruption.
Which brings us right back to the third strategic recommendation: agriculture and human capital.
The source material states that the state must shift water resources away from inefficient traditional farming and toward high-value modern agriculture.
While urgently plugging the junior high dropout leak.
Because you cannot execute a complex 21st century climate finance maneuver if you don't have the endogenous human capital to run it.
If your education system fails to produce the financial analysts and engineers because they dropped out in the 6th grade to work on a low-yield peanut farm,
the state remains permanently dependent on foreign consultants to manage its own economy.
the ultimate conclusion of the source material is incredibly stark. True modernization cannot be built purely on imported debt and an unempowered, physically suffering rural population.
You have to fix the foundation. The foundation always dictates how high the building can safely go.
This has been an incredibly revealing journey through the data. We started by looking at a staggering 123% mobile phone penetration rate and a 13-fold increase in digital banking.
The ultimate African digital miracle.
But by diving into the rigid, minimalist data of this presentation, we've unpacked the mechanisms of how that shiny digital superstructure perfectly, almost seamlessly, masks a society experiencing a severe physical rupture.
A reality where 91% of rural residents are still cooking over open, toxic fires,
Where the schools are hemorrhaging students.
and where the water supply is monopolized by low-efficiency farming. It forces us to entirely redefine what we consider modern.
A digital wallet is an incredible tool, but it is ultimately useless if the person holding it cannot breathe clean air.
Exactly.
And so, for you listening, the practical application of this deep dive is this. The next time you are scrolling through the news and you read a glowing headline praising an emerging market's incredible tech boom,
Or a new billion-dollar valuation for a mobile money app in a developing nation.
I want you to look past the smartphone data. Don't be mesmerized by the digital canopy. Look for the waffle charts.
Look for the unglamorous metrics, like clean cooking fuel access and junior high retention rates.
Because those are the specific mechanisms that reveal the true structural health of the nation.
It's about looking past the illusion of extensive growth and demanding evidence of endogenous stability.
I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over today. Think about the physical mechanics of the digital leapfrog we discussed.
The leap from nothing to cell towers.
Yes, digital infrastructure can easily bypass the state. It floats through the invisible airwaves, funded rapidly by private multinational capital seeking immediate returns.
But our physical, biological survival infrastructure, the water pipes, the clean power grids, the concrete schools, absolutely relies on the state to dig the trenches, enforce the laws, and invest in unprofitable long-term human development.
If private capital continues to build the digital sky, while the state lacks the capacity to fix the physical ground,
Well,
are we heading toward a future where developing nations exist in two completely separate, permanently parallel realities?
will we see a frictionless, cloud-based digital economy floating gracefully and profitably above a physical landscape that remains stubbornly, tragically trapped in the 19th century?
That is the defining question for the next era of global development. Something to think about. Until next time, keep diving deep.